It's also my pleasure to introduce our second speaker today, Dr. Michael Knight, who is the Senior Curator of Chinese Art and Deputy Director of Strategic Programs and Partnerships at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. He's nodding his head. That's a very long title, Michael. I think it speaks to the variety of responsibilities that you have, obviously, at the institution. Michael Knight's career has been a long one, actually, in curatorial work, too. He did his PhD at Columbia University working on objects from the Chu culture of southern China on bronzes and lacquers. And he's literally worked on every possible medium and type of Chinese art in the years since he completed that dissertation with another specialty, a particular specialty in Chinese furniture. I wanted to tell you about some of the catalogs that he's either authored or co-authored just to give a sense of his breadth. Among them are later Chinese jades, the monumental landscapes of Li Huaiyi, Power and Glory, Arts of China's Ming Dynasty, the Elegant Gathering, the Ye Family Collection, which, by the way, was the subject of another wonderful conference that we had here at Berkeley a couple of years ago, and, of course, now Shanghai, Art of the City. Today, his topic is Shanghai Deco, and please join me in welcoming him.
Part of the philosophical foundations we used to develop this exhibition, as we were looking at how to organize what is a very confusing kind of modern city in Shanghai, was kind of the myths and realities of globalization. Shanghai obviously is a good example of a global city having been globalized or in a global context for, by now, almost 160 years. To kind of bring that down into a little bit of a focus, I decided to look at so-called Shanghai Deco furniture. And we have an example up here, and this is what I want to talk about to some extent, if I can make this work now. There we go, okay, this piece of furniture. So what is international about this? Well, it falls into the international context of what is called Art Deco. So a movement would have started in the mid-1920s in Europe and then spread throughout the world. There, Art Deco in Miami, Art Deco in Chicago. Certainly there's Art Deco in Shanghai. But this is not Art Deco that you would find in Paris. This is Art Deco that is unique to Shanghai. So here we have something that is, one, part of a global movement, that is the global Art Deco movement. But it's also very local, and it's local in terms of its materials. So that's one thing that identifies a local type. This is Hongmu, a type of tropical hardwood that would have been used very much for a long period of time in China prior to this time. Was the most valued kind of material for furniture in the late Qing and early Republican era. It's also local in kind of nature of its motifs, the way the motifs are developed. Local uniquely to Shanghai. This is not found in most any other city in China. It's international, it's global in its references to Deco styles, and also into, there's a very big change going on here in the uses of things like mirrors. A mirror like this would not have appeared in Chinese furniture prior to this time, glass, and so on. So this is a fairly complicated textile that's woven out of all kinds of threads of how this kind of global style got to Shanghai and how it was used there. And in order to make that a little bit more comprehensible, what I decided to do was to look at kind of two threads. One, international, and that is an international patron of Deco styles, and that's Victor Sassoon. We heard a little bit about him from Nancy this morning. And then to look at consumers, consumers of Deco furniture, and particularly looking at women as consumers of Deco furniture. There were major changes in the Bund between 1923 and 1925 and the end of the decade. By 1930, things really began to change in terms of Chinese architecture. Along the Bund, public architecture almost anywhere in the city, you begin to see things changing quite a bit. In the earlier periods, coming up to the 1925 period, you see these kinds of Beaux-Arts buildings being put up in great numbers. And of course, as we were talking about this morning, as was being discussed by Jeff this morning, those replaced earlier buildings. What these buildings are looking at, of course, these are the big banks and the big financial structures, institutions that are replacing those earlier trading ports, the trading offices. So there's a real evolution of architectural styles along the Bund that have to do with the changing nature of the city. But as you get into the later part of the 20s and into the 30s, what begins to replace Beaux-Arts styles are these Art Deco styles of architecture. Now, those of you who know anything about architecture know that talking about Beaux-Arts, about Art Deco architecture, this is a construct. It's not a real thing. It didn't exist in 1925. It's something that's applied later. So there are a lot of things that fall into so-called Deco architecture that are called they were called other things at the time. And certainly in Shanghai, they weren't talking about Art Deco architecture, particularly the Chinese. They were talking about modernity. That's what they were looking at. They were looking at making the city a modern city. So here's we got the big changes in kind of architectural styles. We go from Beaux-Arts to so-called Art Deco. That would be on the far side, the Broadway mansions. That'd be more along the lines of streamlined modern if you were to ask somebody who was a real specialist in Western architecture of the time. The same kind of changes were happening in interior design, interior decoration, and that's one of the things that people haven't studied as much as they might. On the near side here, we have the interior of the home of Edward Ezra. So he died in 1921, so we know it predates that. And on the far side, that's one of these wonderful posters of an Art Deco interior, probably the Paramount Ballroom, if one was to look at it. And obviously, there's a big change here. We're going from something that's formal, very European, to something that's very Art Deco. Materials getting to China at this time, you must remember that the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the Panama Canal in 1914, the Transcontinental Railroad was opened in 1869, and things were coming across from Europe and the Americas fairly freely, so it was possible to import a great amount of furniture. And as we were hearing this morning, Carrara marbles, or you name it, materials were getting in and out of China, out of Shanghai, fairly readily. But there was also a need to create materials locally, and that was something that happened. A person who had a big impact on that would have been, I believe, Victor Sassoon. So here's a case study in that, and let's look at Victor Sassoon's, this is his Cathay House, or his Peace Hotel, which was completed somewhere between 1929 and 1930. We know for sure it was done in 1932 because people were witnessing the bombing of Taipei from the building in 1932. It's interesting to find a whole variety of different dates for the openings of these buildings from different publications. So the Cathay Hotel was designed by the architectural firm Palmer and Turner and completed in 1929. That's the date I would use. It was financed by Sir Victor Sassoon and was only one portion of the Sassoon House, which also contained offices and shopping arcades. The Sassoons are an interesting study, and Sir Victor Sassoon is an interesting study in this kind of bringing things, styles from elsewhere into Shanghai. He came to Shanghai, actually, let's give a little bit of his background. He was injured as he grew up in England. In 1914, he was injured as a volunteer to the Royal Flying Corps. He was crippled in an accident, remained crippled and in constant pain for the rest of his life. In 1918, as the fourth generation head of the family, he inherited the family business and returned to Bombay. He had businesses in Bombay, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, and became a prominent member of the textile industry and a leading light, so-called leading light, in horse racing circles. We heard about that this morning as well. He was into horse racing, greyhound racing, and into women. In 1923, he moved the family from India to Shanghai. Labor was cheap there, the taxes were low, foreigners enjoyed many privileges, and so on. He found things too complicated in India, so he moved his entire business out of India and to Shanghai. In 1924, he actually succeeded to the baronetcy of his father on the death of his father, Edward Elias Sassoon, so he was Sir Victor Sassoon for the rest of his life. By the mid-1930s, Sassoon was the top real estate developer in Shanghai, if not all of China, and owned many of Shanghai's Art Deco masterpieces. So the Cathay Hotel was only one of those masterpieces, but was one of many that he built. So it's Deco in style. It can contrast to everything else along the building, not only in its height, and as Nancy was saying this morning, it was 20 stories. The next tallest building at that time was 10, so it was twice as high as anything else. As a matter of fact, when the Bank of China built next to him and wanted to go higher, he said no, and was able to keep that from happening. So it remained the tallest building on the Bund. We saw some of these shots this morning. Nancy was talking about this as well, the interior of the building. He was really interested in getting the cutting edge things that were coming out of Europe at this time. So as we were looking on this exhibition, and we got to go through this building, and at one point they were going to lend, because it's being renovated, they were going to lend large amounts of the materials from the interior. So there's marvelous Lalique glass, there's furniture that was obviously imported, all kinds of materials that were imported, and you get a sense of that kind of opulence in the main entryways and some of the main buildings. Again, everything very cutting edge, very deco, very different than the kind of Beaux-Arts interiors that you would see, for instance, at the Huifeng HSBC Bank or the other kind of major institutions that had been built in the 20s and 30s. But what I find interesting in looking at this is a consistency in the motifs. Now, if you look at let's see if I can get this laser to work. Look at the kind of designs here on the metalwork. This is a back staircase, railing on a back staircase as you're going up to one of the back rooms. And if you look at the furniture, you notice you've got this kind of diamond-shaped motif here, diamond-shaped motif here. You've got the swirls going on here. You've got the swirls going on there. So what Sassoon was doing was bringing lots of things into China to be copied by Chinese artisans, the Chinese people who were creating furniture and these other crafts. And we talked about that a little bit again this morning. Yes, the architects may have been Palmer & Turner, a Hong Kong-based firm with a British background, but the builders, the people who were actually making these buildings, a lot of them were Chinese. And certainly as you started doing the interiors of a hotel like this, he would have hired a lot of Chinese to create these kinds of works. So what he was doing was bringing furnitures and fittings from Europe to China, showing them to the craftsmen, the artisans in Shanghai, and saying, this is what I want you to build. And then they built series after series after series of these. They actually filled this hotel up with this kind of material. That, of course, was a point of entree for the Chinese artisans making furniture. So as a market developed for Deco furniture, this is one of their point of entree. They were familiar with the motifs, the designs, the structures, and so on, and they were to carry that on. If you think of the number of hotels that were built in Shanghai in this period and throughout this period, all over the city, and you think of when you build a hotel, it's not like building an apartment building where you build a basic structure and then somebody else does the interior. When you build a hotel, you build the whole thing. So you have to do the interior design as well as the exterior structure. All of these hotels were being decorated by these Chinese artisans. A lot of the work was being done by Chinese artisans that were filling these hotels. So that was a point of entree. That's one of these kind of international styles getting interpreted and done by local artisans. Does that make sense? All right. Oops, I went backwards. I'm still going backwards. So there are a series of these, and it's very consistent. The nature of the furniture throughout has this kind of swirling design with the diamond in the middle, and it's throughout the entire building. It's kind of nice about this one as you're looking at this very Chinese-made thing, and there's a Tiffany lamp sitting on the top. Walking through the building was really a lot of fun. It was under demolition, and the nature of the construction was also interesting to see. Okay, but there's something else goes on at this time as well. I think the Lilong that we were talking about this morning is one thing, but another thing is apartment buildings. And apartment buildings are very different from hotels in the sense that as an architect, you build the apartment building, but the interior design is done by somebody else. The person who owns the individual apartment or lives in the individual apartment actually has the design done. So it's a very different kind of approach. And again, Sassoon was involved in a lot of these major apartment buildings, in this case, the Grosvenor House, which was done in 1934, again by what seems to have been one of his favorite architectural firm, Palmer & Turner. So you see here, again, a very large building with lots and lots of apartment buildings that need individual apartments that need to be decorated. And you also see at the same time, amongst Western as well as Chinese clients, large-scale individual houses being done, standalone houses being done in kind of so-called Beaux-Arts or modern styles. Some of them done, Hudek, again, this great architect who had fled from Russia into China at this time, into Shanghai. He did a number of these kinds of buildings. So how did these interiors of these apartment buildings get decorated? Deke Eyre and Tess Johnston argue that there were literally thousands of interior decorators working in Shanghai. Some of them Chinese, some of them not. But certainly there was a profession that was just developing at that time in Europe as well. The artist interior designer, the designer who's doing high fashion houses and doing the interior of those high fashion houses, or is doing high fashion apartment buildings. I was able to find only really one image of that, and in this case, on the far side there, it's a German design firm, the Deutsches Werkenstation, And it's still in an Art Deco building. It still exists in Shanghai today. That building is still there, though the firm is no longer there. The building is still there. And they were the source of ordering a lot of the furniture and having the furniture built at the various kinds of manufacturers around. How am I doing on time? I see you moving something there. 5 minutes? Oh dear. All right, we'll keep moving. So they were having the furniture ordered from these various kinds of factories around Shanghai. So let's get to the women very, very quickly. And I think there's a whole panel on that later this afternoon. Women in Shanghai were very quickly associated with Art Deco styles. I mean, whether that had to do with Sassoon and his particular taste or whatever, certainly right away, 1920s, 1930s, you have women in Shanghai, modern styles, a quick association. Women were often objects of consumption. They were being consumed, as one would expect would be shown here. And we have a number of images like that in the exhibition. Women as objects of consumption, the taxi dancers, or the Shanghai version of the Vargas girl. But almost always they appear, or very often, they appear in a modern or Art Deco, a very modern Art Deco kind of interior. They also sold things. They were not just being consumed, they also sold things. So in the near side, we have an image of a woman, but again, in a kind of Deco environment. You see the Deco kind of designs here. There's the Deco, of course, incorporates materials from China. In European Deco, there are motifs from China that go there. So there's an association between Deco and Chinese styles as well. But here we have a woman who's selling the city of Shanghai. And here we have a woman on a Deco piece of furniture, very much a modern Deco piece of furniture, and she's selling cigarettes. So in part she's being consumed, in part she's selling something. Then there's these kind of mid-range images of these posters of the kind of the modern woman in Shanghai, and something that's being redefined in the 30s, really, of the modern woman. And part of that kind of national goods movements and modern women movements. And here we see a different kind of woman, not just entirely as a sex object, but something vital and educated and so on. And you begin to get these women who, clearly she can read. So this is an educated middle-class consumer of goods, and the woman becomes a very important consumer of goods. And there were entire magazines, kind of lifestyle magazines, that were directed towards these women as consumers. We have these on view, the exterior of these on view at the museum, and you can get an idea of, again, the woman gets to be more of a real person and much more, has a greater identity. But their real importance, as what Wen-Chin was talking about this morning, was they had control of the purse strings and they bought things. So as you go into the interior of these magazines, it's page after page after page of advertising. And what they're directing the advertisements not to the man, but to the woman. Now sometimes you see a pretty woman standing next to a car, and a car is a status symbol for the man, and the woman is the object as much as the car is. But often these are very directed at the women. So you have women with radios, women with movie cameras, and the whole movie industry in Shanghai at the time. You also have women with refrigerators, and you have women with telephones. So these kinds of advertisements, they're directed with the understanding that the woman was the major consumer of this kind of goods in these middle-class households throughout Shanghai. Oh dear. Women also consumed furniture, and a lot of the interiors of these houses were designed with the woman in mind. So as we look at these images, you very, very often see a woman in a wonderful dress sitting in front of a dresser, a vanity, a dresser, a table of some sort of this type. They were obviously consuming these textiles, but more than that, they were really consuming, there were a whole series of kinds of so-called Deco or Art Deco furniture that were designed for the women. Entire rooms, entire interiors with that consumer, that woman consumer in mind. And that brings us very quickly back to this set of furniture. This was clearly this is a set of 13 pieces that is a whole suite that is designed, it has all the same designs all the way throughout. So it was done as a single suite, a bedroom suite. I would believe that the major patron for this would have been a woman. Look at all the mirrors, look at the dressing table, and so on and so forth. So again, a marvelous kind of very sophisticated taste, very highly finished, obviously meant for somebody of great wealth, but probably a woman of great wealth was the major kind of patron for this kind of piece of furniture. I had a little bit more to talk about on how these pieces were constructed and how that shows the kind of the mix of international and Chinese, but I'll leave that for another day. Thank you all very much.